So cool to see a Gatsby conference and then see everyone here. So super excited to be here. Super excited to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, which is Gatsby for apps. And so for anyone who has been following Gatsby webinars and this kind of thing before, this has been a very heavily requested topic. And so my hope today is to prove and show once and for all that Gatsby isn't just a static site generator, that Gatsby is also great for apps as well. So first, First, a brief little intro. So as Linda said, my name is Dustin Schau. I'm the team lead of customer success at Gatsby. And I was previously and always on the core team. And I just moved to Mountain View, California from the middle of America. So that's been quite a change, big adjustment. And I'm engaged to a triplet. Also, another fun fact is I just flew in an hour ago. So I'm extremely jet lagged, which is just going to be entirely conducive to a great talk. So for anyone who has used Gatsby, which I hope is everyone, what you've probably also heard is Gatsby called Gatsby is just a static site generator, right? It's kind of just like Jekyll, and well yes, but actually more importantly no. That's really not the mental model I hold for what Gatsby is and what Gatsby can do for you. So what I want to show today is not only that Gatsby can be used for applications, but that Gatsby is an excellent choice for your next dynamic web application. So when we talk about rich apps, web apps, what even does that mean? What are we really saying when we're well, Gatsby is just a static site? What I really want is an application. And so what I want to first do is take a step back and let's kind of talk about some defining characteristics of a web application. So the first of which I think is a pretty clear one is dynamic data. And so this is just data that might be tailored to the user. It might just be data that needs to be fetched from an API. Oftentimes with Gatsby, someone might set up a Lambda or a simple little GraphQL server to fetch your dynamic data. And so this can be a response to an action. So you might have a to-do list and you add a to-do. All right, we need to make this list dynamic. And so of course this can definitely be used in Gatsby. Client-side JavaScript, so things like animations, things really fluid and nice interactions in your application. These are typically done with client-side JavaScript, which again is kind of a hallmark of a rich web application. Authentication, so this is a big one because I think it's probably one of the more common questions we get at Gatsby is, how do I do auth with Gatsby? And so I'll get into the ins and outs of how it's actually done. And then of course, PWA functionality. I'm kind of just catching up to some of the unconference sessions, but it sounds like PWA was a big one. And so definitely PWA functionality, things like service workers, manifest files, et cetera, are key to what we think of as a modern web app. And so this is Justice Potter Stewart defining something that I probably should not mention, but he says, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, defining the concept, but I know it when I see it. And I think this is very much the case with web applications. It's kind of hard to define this checklist of when's it a static site, when's it an app, I think how we can really show this is just look at some examples. And so my two most favorite, I don't know about most favorite, two key ones in my mind are Gmail and then Twitter. And so Twitter is a great example of a PWA. They use React, and it's a really nice React application, and it's kind of a key exemplar of what I think of as a web app. And then Gmail was, one of, at least to my mind, first oh, we can do this native functionality in a web browser, and the experience is actually pretty great. And so I think of these two as my key, like I said, exemplars for what a web application is. In other words, I know it when I see it, and I know these are web apps. And so the kind of goal of this talk is what if I told you that Gatsby can be used for web apps because a Gatsby application is a React application? Mind blown. This is the whole talk. So Gatsby is an app compiler for React. And so, like I said, feel free to call it a static site generator. That is technically true. But I think of The mental model I hold more for Gatsby is an app compiler for React. So we're going to optimize your React application. We're going to configure the right bells and whistles, aka Webpack and Babel and other niceties, and we'll do it all for you so that you can focus on delivering an engaging application experience to your users, to your users at the end of the day. And so the other key point here is that Gatsby is just React. So sure, there's GraphQL. There are some Gatsby isms that are a little bit different than just vanilla boilerplate React. But at the end of the day, the application you're writing is a React application. And so when you kind of think of your application in these terms, it becomes a lot clearer what Gatsby can do, because it's what can React do, which is everything. So because Gatsby produces a React application, you can do effectively everything that you can do in a normal React application. So I want to first kind of talk through some of those questions that I mentioned earlier, some of those use cases for what I think of as a web application. So first, one of the most common questions is, how do I do authentication in Gatsby? And I kind of push back on this, because it's not so much how do you do Gatsby or how do you do authentication in Gatsby. The question really is, how do I do authentication in React? And so if you've used a solution in React in the past, more often than not, it's going to work just fine in Gatsby, because again, Gatsby is a React application. And so how I typically do authentication in my Gatsby apps, just like I do in React applications. So I have an auth API. I might create a library or use a library for it, so like auth0 or something like that. I quite like to use the React context API. So it's a really great API for pulling this auth data into any component in my React application tree. And then you can kind of use this React context to redirect to a login page. You can do private routes that require authentication. And so these kind of three ideas really work quite nicely in implementing authentication in your React, really in your Gatsby applications. Ooh. Hopefully that's relatively readable. a little more than 9 lines of code. But so this is a simple example, not really quite working yet, but we'll show at the end how we could get this working, of using context to implement authentication with an authentication provider. And so the idea here is that we're using hooks because they're pretty great. And so first we'll do use effect. So kind of on component mount, because we're passing an empty array, we're going to send a fetch to this authentication API, and then we're setting authentication status. So if the user is authenticated, they can see the content they need. If not, we'll expose a login or logout functionality so that the user can authenticate. So another great question is, how do I do progressive web apps in Gatsby? And really, I think it's how do you do it in React? And so the kind of hallmarks of a progressive web app are several. But generally, you'll probably want to register a service worker. You'll probably want a manifest so that it'll show up nicely in Chrome and other Android devices. And I think of Gatsby as kind of like a platform. So use our platform, use our plugin ecosystem for a shortcut to building out a progressive web application really quickly and really easily. So the really kind of two key plugins here are Gatsby plugin offline, which we just shipped 3.0 with some nice new features. David, so definitely check it out. It's pretty great. And then Gatsby plugin manifest. These two couple together really nicely so that you can deliver your users a great PWA experience with a couple of NPM commands, a few options, and then you can kind of call it a day. And again, focus on delivering and shipping features, not on implementing these lower level patterns for PWA. So how do I do dynamic requests in Gatsby? Again, it's really more how do I do it in React. So it's the same solution. So again, I'm using hooks here. And so let's say I have a tweets component where I want to asynchronously fetch new tweets. And so I'm setting up a use state hook. And then so I have tweets and then a set tweets method. And then on component mount in effect, I'm going to fetch new tweets from this API and then update this component to re-render when I have new tweets. And so obviously I've kind of yada the implementation details, but it's, imagine a list and I'm rendering some tweets. Nothing really earth-shattering there. So this is the one that I think trips people up a fair amount, or at least it is the the most different than traditional React. And so I wanted to go into a little bit of detail as to like a recommended approach and what I think works quite well for a pattern called like client-only routes. And so if you haven't heard this term before, so in Gatsby, your routes are statically generated as much as possible, but we also have this notion of client-only routes, which are going to be routes that are only rendered on the browser. So like the classic example would be like authenticated routes, or like a route that has like a parameter. So you might have like users and then like an ID, and so you want to fetch just that user's details. And these are both key characteristics and key like markers for when you might be needing client-only routes. And so, generally the same story here. The routing, we use reach router, and so you can just configure a top-level router, and then we have this notion of client-only routes. So what I recommend using is Gatsby plugin create client pass. You can also wire this up yourself with the lower-level APIs that this plugin uses. It's really your personal preference, but it's very on-brand, and I think very nice pattern to like just use a plugin. It like does the same thing, makes it a little bit easier to configure, and works the same at the end of the day. So this is like the gotcha, is that you have to configure this. And so what I'm doing here is I'm configuring Gatsby plugin create client pass. I'm giving it a prefix, so any route that begins with app is going to be a client-only route, and will be rendered on the browser, not on the server. And so what the routing implementation looks like could look something quite like this. So here I have a couple of routes, a couple of views. So user, admin, and then login. I'm using the top-level router exposed by reach router, our routing implementation. And then I'm also using a protected route. So this is going to use that auth context I showed earlier, and it will just redirect when a user isn't authenticated and doesn't have access to access this page. Generally, you'll couple that with like server-side auth, so ensuring that the user actually has access to this route. And so this is a client technique to just show them the login page and get them logged in, but you'll also want to add in some server-side logic to ensure that the user has the right permissions to request the assets they're requesting. So you're kind of getting the theme here. How do I do like X, Y, and Z in Gatsby? And more often than not, the answer is how do I do that same thing in React, which I think is like a really appealing pattern, at least to me, because the React ecosystem is huge, amazing, and like I love being a part of it. And so by using Gatsby, you can tap into the bulk, if not all of this React ecosystem. And so when you solve a problem in React, you can also solve that same problem in Gatsby. And so what I really want to kind of like show today, and I probably haven't shown thus far, is that you not only can build apps with Gatsby, but I think you should build apps with Gatsby. And now I want to kind of defend this perhaps outlandish statement. And so I think why you'd want to build your application with Gatsby is for like a few key reasons. So the first of which is SSR at build time. And so this kind of throws people off a little bit sometimes because they think, well, Gatsby is not server-side rendered. Gatsby is rendered, at build time, and that's true. But it's using the same kind of server-side rendering APIs. It's using React DOM server, just like something like Next does. The big spin though is that we're doing it at build time, so that there isn't like a server-side rendering cost. The server-side rendering cost is kind of consumed by you. It's a build time cost. And so I would much rather pay a build time cost than like a runtime cost spinning up 10, 15, 20 node servers. I think going static makes a lot of problems a hell of a lot easier. And so I think when you go static, when you do this SSR at build time, you get a really like great application, nice metrics like TTI, and I think your users will love it. And you'll spend less money in doing so too. Vibrant plugin ecosystem. I've touched on this like a fair amount thus far, but I think one of the key appealing characteristics of Gatsby is that if you want to do thing X, thing Y, or thing Z, maybe it already exists in React and you can just use a library, but if it's something specific to Gatsby, if I want to do a service worker, if I want my app to work offline, if I want to do a manifest, if I want to do an RSS feed, there's probably a plugin for it, and that plugin will probably exactly match your use case for what you're really looking for. And so I think we say it maybe too often, but it's also true. It's like Gatsby is like just React. Of course, there are some Gatsbyisms, like I said, but again, by just using React, we can like tap into this huge ecosystem, and I think just as importantly, this huge like collective brain power of like, everyone who's in the React space. All of your projects, or most of your projects, are probably in the React space, or you've at least done several projects in React, and so you can reuse that React knowledge. You can reuse that React component library that you really quite like, because it's just React. And then one of the key ones that makes for a pretty good demo that I'll show in a little bit is App Shell. And so App Shell is a really nice pattern where you render pieces of your application and then kind of like hydrate in the actual dynamic data requests. And so to a user, the application actually feels faster, even though it's more of a perception thing, because the application is really going to be loading at the same time. And so I think a GIF, whatever, is is very effective here. So on the left, we have a Gatsby application with an app shell. So we're rendering like a sidebar, a header, and a footer. And then this will be fetched from the service worker. And then in the middle, we're loading our dynamic data. Pretend it's like a list of items or something. And then on the right, we have like a traditional server-side rendered application, rendered from a Node.js server. And you'll see they kind of load at the same time. But at least to me, the Gatsby application feels much, much faster, much, much quicker. And your users are going to, I think, enjoy the experience better because your application feels faster, even if it's not necessarily faster. Although it probably is faster too. So for me, I think that perceived performance is just as, if not more so, important than actual performance. And I think a really great way to maximize perceived performance is to use Gatsby and use some of these patterns. And so another key thing we do is when you use the link component in Gatsby, what we'll do is we'll optimistically prefetch the next route so that by the time your user actually does click that link, it's already preloaded, it's already pre-rendered. And so again, nothing like super like earth-shattering there, but what your users experience is like a crazy fast application, and that's the experience that we want to ship to your end users and that we want to enable you to ship to your end users. So for me, I like to use Gatsby to eliminate this trade-off between actual performance and perceived performance. And so I think by using Gatsby, it really isn't a trade-off. It's your application is, shockingly, blazingly, insert buzzword here for fast. And then, so it not only is fast, it also feels fast because we're using some of these patterns, and that we enable you to use some of these patterns as well. So how I think of it. I'm incredibly biased, but there's fast and then there's Gatsby fast. And I think this is really what your users care about. It's actually really, really cool. There was a web dev subreddit thread on kind of reverse engineering reactjs.org, which is a Gatsby site. And it was super cool because it's like every page load feels like super quick. And everything just feels like it's blazing fast. And I do think it's oftentimes overstated, but I do think that you kind of know when you're using a Gatsby application, and it just really does feel like it's not only fast, but it's like Gatsby fast. And this is what we want to enable for everyone. So I think it's important to show and not merely just tell. So now I have a brief demo. So I'll need to share my screen too. So this is not actually my screen. There we go. Okay. So what I want to do is, oops, one sec. Is I want to build in authentication to a Gatsby application. One sec to get everything set up. Oh yeah, that's gonna break something. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is open up localhost 8008. Okay, sorry about that. So people might have seen this demo before. I built a Gmail clone called Gatsby Mail, and no, we are not pivoting into email applications, just for a fun demo, just to show that Gatsby not only can be used for this type of web app, but it's a great choice for this kind of web app. And so what I first want to show is just my auth util. And so let me zoom this in a little bit. So this is I'm using OneGraph auth. OneGraph's a great kind of like schema stitching for a bunch of different GraphQL APIs, so Gmail, Twitter, etc. So I'm using the Gmail portion of this. And so this is actually, it's 14 lines of code. And this is a way that I can get like an auth client that I can then inject into context. And so I can build in that authentication experience that I expect in Gatsby, or that I want to build with my Gatsby app. So close the app. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to get these windows right. There we go, finally. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to build in a context, authentication context, using that auth utility I just showed. So I'm going to use a couple things in React, notably hooks. So use state, use effect, and then use ref. And so use state is going to hold my authentication state. Use effect is going to check on mount whether I'm authenticated, and then use ref is going to store a reference to my auth client. So first thing is I'll set up authenticated, and then set authenticated equals use state. And then by default, it's going to be false because we want to check on mount every time. Next, we're going to set up our auth ref, which is just going to be use ref. And then finally, we want to use effect, and then we'll pass an empty depths array so that this just runs the once. Effectively, component did mount. Oops. And so first we want to just check if a ref has been set. So if not, we'll do auth.current, and then we'll use get auth. And then here we'll actually set, so auth.current, and then that OneGraph auth client has a number of helpful methods here. The first of which is logged in, which is going to return a promise. So auth status, and then we'll set auth. Oops. We'll set auth with our auth status. Okay, and so I'll save this, and this won't do anything because we're not authenticated. And actually, it has broken. What was that? It's not, ooh, right, yeah, thank you. Boolean logic is hard, huh? All right, so let's just refresh this. Well. All right, that should work. Shouldn't have to do it. I don't know. Is logged in. You know what? Let's just. We won't use a ref. We'll just do this. Keep this. All right. Oh no. Well, here, let's just. Ta-da! All right, so that's embarrassing, but I think I just had something a little messed up here. What I really wanted to show though is this piece right here. So this is just our login function, which is quite simple. So we're just going to await auth.current.login, and then we'll say authenticated using our hook. Log out's the same way. So if we bring this all home, we'll log in with Google. We'll select my account. We'll allow whatever. And we are loading our mail. So that's Gatsby mail showing an authenticated context with Gatsby. And finally, one last thing is I really like showing the app shell pattern. And so if we log in again, this is obviously not localhost anymore. We'll allow. And then if we throttle our connection to just fast 3G, you can see that the header loads, the footer loads, and then the actual content loads. And so the end user experience is still quite great. And we have delivered this app-like experience, this app experience using Gatsby. So yeah, let me wrap this up. So yeah, that is it. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.